The on-air light is on, so we can begin. It's officially 9:30. Good morning, welcome. Good to see everybody this morning. We are in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 this morning. Just a heads up, next week is the 27th. Yanni and I are going to be gone. Josh Yancey is going to take the class, and I think he's been doing a on-again, off-again study of James, I believe. So we talked about it last week. I think he's going to do that. So I'll be back in 2 weeks. I got a glitch in my work schedule, so I got to check that out. But at this point, the plan is I'll be back 2 weeks from today, and we'll do the next chapter in 1 Corinthians, which is about the Lord's Supper. So that's kind of where we're going with that. So today is 1 Corinthians 10, 1 through 13, and this is it's got one of my favorite, verse 13 is one of my favorite verses. I have a list, I'm sure you do too, list of favorites, my all-time favorite verses, and that's one of them. And in Greek mythology, there was a character, Theseus, who was a legendary mythical king of Athens. And one of the claims to fame for him was that he went to Crete and killed a monster, the Minotaur, in the labyrinth. You've heard these words before. You've heard the word labyrinth. You've heard about minotaurs. Those kind of show up. Allusions to them show up. And the king of Crete at that time in the myth was named Minos, and the Minotaur came from his name and so forth. And if you were to ask a Greek person, a Corinthian person in the time of Paul, when did Theseus live, they would have just said, a long time ago. I don't know how Greeks shrug or kind of make that motion, but it was, something like that. A long time ago. They didn't have the same perception of time and how time works as we do today. It wasn't very important to them. In much of the pagan cultures, the perception of time was very circular or cyclical. Birth, growth, death, birth, growth, death. You throw in a little bit of work and having more children. But there was this cyclical pattern of life that just kept repeating itself. Likewise, in nature, raising crops, planting, harvesting, it would just go on and on and on. And their thought about time was that it just kept coming back around. What goes around comes around. So I don't think that's where that came from necessarily, but that's how they looked at the world and how they looked at time and so forth. So the idea of a past and history and so forth was very, very different. The biblical perception of time is that there was a beginning, right? Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then as time unfolds, we see God begin to communicate with mankind, first through the patriarchs, then through Moses, later through Christ in the New Testament. And so there was a beginning and there was a forward movement into the future. And that's how we look at time. And so when we think of the past, we think of things that happened. The Greeks would have thought about Theseus and gone, well, he was a king, he lived a long time ago. Maybe he was in time, maybe he wasn't in time. It wasn't, I don't even know if they would have believed he was real. They did believe the deities were real. But we look at these characters, especially from the Bible, and we say, well, these are real people. You read about creation, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses. These are real people. This stuff really happened. So we have the biblical record that informs us of where we've come from, who we are, what life is supposed to be about. And there are lessons to be learned from looking at the past. And that is all about what Paul is doing in chapter 10 of 1 Corinthians. So the things that where Paul is in dealing with the Corinthians and their issues, and we've talked about that quite a bit as we've gone through this study, the Gentiles who are Christians now that Paul addresses, they come out of this very pagan world, this very idolatrous kind of background. They believed in the pagan deities, Zeus and Apollo and those folks. It was a very immoral kind of world, immoral kind of religion. Lots of sexual activity in the temple as part of their worship experience. And we talked last week about eating food offered to idols, and that was part of that. They'd have a big feast and so forth. And so, these people are coming out of that, trying to understand God's will for them and how to think and live and behave as Christians. It's very difficult. And, some of you, no doubt, became Christians as adults, and there were things from your past that, you had to kind of deal with and recognize first, and then reconcile that. Many of us grew up in the church, and we went through very similar kinds of experiences, unfortunately, where we played around in the world and had to get out of that. So it's not a big stretch for us to understand why these people are having so many issues, and that's what was going on there. But in helping them and answering their questions, then Paul deals with them, and then of course we gain a lot of lessons from that as well. So one of the issues for the Corinthians was how much of that stuff from our recent past do we have to get rid of? Can we go to the temple just to eat? Can we eat meat from the market, which would have been initially offered in the temple, at a friend's house? Is the meat tainted for some reason because it came from the temple? If we go to the temple but we don't engage in the sketchy stuff, is that okay? That's kind of where they're coming from, for a variety of reasons. One is, it's difficult to be the oddball outsider that doesn't jump in with everybody else in whatever activity is happening. And some of that stuff, meat's really good. The other things could be perceived as fun. So if you don't have to give it up, maybe you don't want to. And so they're asking some serious questions, and Paul is trying to give them some serious answers. And this is part of, I think I mentioned this last week, but chapter 8, where we started last week, goes all the way through this part of chapter 10, through the end of chapter 10. And the whole section is dealing with this idea of meat offered to idols, the temple behavior and that stuff, and how do we as Christians deal with that. So it's a longer section. In the end, Paul reaches the conclusion and communicates to the Corinthians, stay out of the temple. Don't go back there, and be very careful what else you engage in not in the temple. Like if you're going to have folks home, or you're going to go to someone's house for dinner and they have meat there, you kind of know where it came from. Just be careful about that and so forth. So he's going to end up being clear, but he works through all these issues and questions to help them think it through and help them understand and come to some of their own conclusions as well. So in chapter 10, as part of that, he is going to share a bunch of really terrible missteps on the part of Israel and their experiences that got them into real big trouble early on. So by doing that, he can show the Corinthians, here's what happens when you stay in this kind of pagan, idolatrous kind of setting. It can go really bad for you. So he's using that as example. So these will be some of the stuff that we'll reference today will be familiar stories. Most of them come from Numbers, actually, but and we're not going to go back and read them all, but you'll know them when we talk about them. Let's go ahead and read chapter 10, 1 Corinthians, verses 1 through 5. For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers, that our forefathers were all under the cloud, and that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered over the desert. So it's an interesting reference there to in verse 2 to being baptized into Moses. And this is a kind of a figurative way of looking at it. You know, think about when Israel leaves Egypt, and there was one big thing that they saw initially, and that was God demonstrating his presence with them through, what was it, a cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. And wherever that cloud or pillar would go, they would follow. And it talks about in the Exodus and you know, through that section of the Pentateuch, it talks about how, you know, they'd set up camp and maybe they'd be there for a long time, maybe they'd just be there overnight, and the cloud would start, or I guess they would wait till God would wait until daylight. The cloud would start to move, and they'd pack up and go on. So they were following the cloud. Well, what do we get from clouds? We get water from clouds, usually. So there's that. Then they get to the Red Sea, and the Egyptians are hot on their heels. And God, through Moses, parts the waters of the Red Sea, and they pass through the water. They didn't get wet. In fact, the text tells us it was like dry ground, but they passed through the sea. So there's another there's water involved here. So when Paul says they were baptized into Moses, he's kind of playing off of these images of what happened. I don't think they didn't take everybody and dunk them immerse them like we do today. It was not for that purpose, certainly, but it was an illusion that they would have understood. But one thing that is common in both of those cases is that when we're baptized, we immediately begin to identify with Christ as our Lord, as our head, and so forth. And when Israel experienced this, they immediately began to identify with God as their Lord and Master, and so forth. Surely to goodness, for a few moments at least, when they were on the shores of the Red Sea, on the other side of the Red Sea, and they looked back and saw the waters part and drown the Egyptian army, they had to have gone, wow, look what God did. They had their moments of stupidity, of abject, nonsensical, what were you thinking? And we're going to talk about some of them. But there had to have been times when they were just amazed at what God did. And that would have been one of them. So that would have been easy for them to say, oh yeah, we're going to follow him and listen to him. They didn't always, but they had that intention at least. So it cements their relationship with God, and in some degrees also with Moses. So Paul talks about that. He talks also about they ate the same spiritual food. So you got, maybe a couple of million people wandering in the Sinai desert. My understanding is there's not a lot of food that's hanging around there. They don't have, I started to say they don't have Publix. We don't have Publix here either, but they don't have the, whatever the chain of grocery stores is that we have here, a Mega Market or something. They don't have those. They got to do something for food, and God sends manna. So every night the manna would fall. They would gather it up. You know how that story goes. It was a miraculous thing. And he did that for how long? 40 years. The lesson a couple of weeks ago talked about when they go into the promised land, right before Jericho, the manna stopped. So it was that long that they had the manna. After they ate the manna for a while, they kind of started to get tired of it, and they said, oh, we would like to have some meat, please. Actually, they demanded meat, and so then God sent like flocks of quail. And so it was real quail, but it was miraculous that God sent it at the right time and provided that for them, and it became food. So they get spiritual food, manna and quail, and there was spiritual drink. There was the water that came from the rock. So Paul highlights all of this to tell us about Israel and their beginning experiences and how God had provided for them. And what we see there are at least 4 benefits that the Israelites had that came from following God. So the first was they were guided by God in the cloud. So you're out there, you've never been outside of Egypt, you've always been a slave, having people tell you where to go, what to do, etc. Suddenly you're free. What are we going to do? We'll follow the cloud. It's a pretty good benefit if you don't know what you're doing out there. So they're guided by God in the cloud. The second benefit was they crossed the Red Sea, crossed through the Red Sea when the waters parted. So they escaped the Egyptian army coming after them. They were saved from that danger, that calamity. They were fed miraculously through manna and quail. So there's a third benefit that they had received. And they were given water from a miraculous source. We got Moses into trouble later on, but still they had water. They were fed water. Did I say that? They were given water to drink from this miraculous source. And yet, with all of these benefits, how many of those people made it to the promised land? Y'all know the answer to that. Two made it. And how long did it take them? 40 years. So with all of the benefits, there still were problems. So that's Paul's introduction to the thought of this section. And it was all because the only reason was because of their lack of faith, which led to disobedience and their immorality. And he's going to address that here in just a minute. So Paul's making it clear that even though you can receive blessings from God, you can still do things that God will disapprove of. Just because you're blessed doesn't mean you're, exempt from that. So if Israel could be punished, maybe the Corinthians could be punished. If Israel tries to play around with immorality and so forth, maybe the Corinthians might face that same fate as well. So that's where he begins in this part of the text. Let's go to verse 6, and we'll read down through verse 11. Now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in pagan revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality as some of them did. And in one day, 23,000 of them died. We should not test the Lord as some of them did and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble as some of them did and were killed by the destroying angel. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the fulfillment of the ages has come. So Paul is now beginning to exhort the Corinthians to learn from the Israelites' mistake. No doubt in the congregation there would have been Jewish Christians, a few anyway, and they would have understood all of these allusions quite readily, and they would know the stories, and maybe, you've got to hope, that some of them would be trying to help the Gentile Christians understand that, this direction that you guys want to go in is not going to be good for you. It's not going to work out. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But Paul wants the Corinthians to see this and start to see, there's a dangerous direction here that we may be going in, and we need to be careful of that. So he lists several examples, several stories as warnings. The first one refers to Exodus 32, when Moses is up on Mount Sinai getting the 10 Commandments, and all of Israel is down on the ground praying for his success, right? They're all very piously waiting, patiently, for Moses to bring the law back from God, right? Not really. What really was going on while Moses was spending time communing with God, getting the law, Israel is doing the golden calf. Not only is Israel doing the golden calf, Aaron is doing the golden calf, Moses' brother. So the first reference here is to that. He says, do not be idolaters as some of them were. The people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in pagan revelry. That is Exodus 32, verse 6. So when big things are happening, the people are already, this is not that long after crossing the Red Sea. They haven't come that far. They haven't been doing this that long. They should still be going, remember what happened. It was just recent. But already they began to kind of backslide. So there's that kind of warning that Paul gives them. The next one is in verse 8. We should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 of them died. That's a reference to Numbers 25, where the Israelite men engaged in immorality with the Moabite women. And they did that, and a bunch of them were killed by God because of that immorality. Again, it hasn't been that long. They've not come that far. Been a little bit of time, but not that long. This stuff should be fresh in their memories. And I say that, and we sometimes will bash Israel for their lack of faith and their short-sightedness, but I think that's a human thing, and I think all of us struggle from time to time with our faith and short-sightedness and so forth. So we can't get too high on our horse or self on our righteousness about that, because we as human beings often suffer the same kinds of things. So there's two examples, the golden calf, immorality with the Moabites. In verse 9, he refers to Numbers 21, where everybody's grumbling and complaining and murmuring, and the snakes come, and Moses makes the bronze serpent and all that stuff. And I can just imagine, well, I think I can imagine, probably can't really imagine, but if you're put yourself in God's shoes, in God's position, and you have these people that you've pulled them out of slavery, you're providing everything that they need, and all they do is gripe and complain. And if you've ever been in a situation where you're around people that's all they do is gripe and complain, it just wears you out. And here God's got a couple million of them, just wearing them out. And there were times, he even says to Moses, at least once, I'm going to wipe these guys out and start over with you. And Moses talks him out of that. But so here's this case where they're just complaining, and he sends the snakes, and they, and all that. So here's another case where people who should know better, should be better, they're not. And then finally in verse 10, the grumbling and murmuring. This is from Numbers chapter 16. So here's a series of, we get in the first section references to, here are the benefits that Israel had. And then in 6 through 10, here's what they did with the benefits. They didn't do well. They grumbled, they complained, they were immoral, they were unfaithful. They were a pain in the neck. They kind of, threw it all back in God's face. And so then verse 11 kind of repeats this warning. These happened as examples. They were written down. He says they were written down as warnings for us. Which is true. I always stress again that, when we read the Old Testament and the New Testament, but especially there's such great stories in the Old Testament, and those are real people. And Abram and Sarai and their struggle with fertility and having a child, that was a real struggle. And people still go through those struggles. All the conflict in the family with Joseph and his brothers. And Jacob's kind of not really paying attention, didn't solve some issues. It kind of adds to it, Those are real struggles that people have, conflicts in their family. All these things happened in real time and in real life. They were recorded, and it was, they were people who were experiencing their relationship with God and then their stories remain for the rest of us. So it's a cool way to look at things, and for me it kind of helps reinforce God's wisdom and power, that all this stuff happens to these people, but then how wonderfully it addresses our situations, and how well we can learn and gain from those things. And also remember that in the time of Paul, the New Testament was still being written. So for the Christians in Corinth, when they went to church, the scripture readings were coming from what we call the Old Testament. That's the Bible they had. Paul writes some of his earliest letters become New Testament books. The Gospels didn't come until a little bit later. Revelation came at the end of the first century. So they were writing the Bible, the New Testament, as they went. I don't take that to mean they were making it up as they go, because they didn't make it up. But it was being recorded as they went through this stuff. So they were reading what we call the Old Testament. And so when Paul says, these are examples and they serve to inform us, that's true. And that's what's going on there. So what's going on with the Corinthians? Well, they were idolaters, and the immorality and all that stuff, they would have been engaged with all of that. And so Paul is now kind of not being so subtle. Here's what Israel was doing. It compares very clearly to what you all have been doing. It went really badly for them. It's going to go really badly for you. And they probably were beginning to make those connections themselves, the Corinthians. And Israel experienced all this stuff because of their unfaithfulness and their willingness to be influenced into idolatry and so forth. And that continued with Israel for a really long time. I think it didn't really get settled until they returned from exile. There was, after Solomon, Rehoboam, there was the kingdom divided. You had Judah and Israel continued to struggle with idolatry pretty big time. Judah kind of more or less stayed faithful. And then later, when they, a few generations of kings later, they go into exile and they finally come back, and I guess they finally started to get it. Oh, idols are bad. Who would have thunk that? So they struggled with this for a really long time. So for the Corinthians that were kind of leaning back or toying with going back or trying to dabble and play around with it still just a little bit, hopefully this was beginning to get through to them and make sense to them. If God was really unhappy with this behavior in the past, he's probably really unhappy with this behavior in the present. And then if you look into the future, he's probably going to still be unhappy with that kind of behavior as we move forward. Do we have any thoughts, comments, observations? All right. I asked. All right, let's go ahead and finish out chapter 10, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 12 and 13. So he said all this. These were examples written for you and so forth. So if you think you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. No temptation has seized you except what is common to man. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can stand up under it. And I said in the beginning that's one of my favorite verses, verse 13. That has helped me a lot of times through a lot of years in a lot of different kinds of situations. But I like that little, if you think you're standing firm, just kind of be careful. Don't pat yourself too hard on the back. Don't think too highly of yourselves. He's addressing specifically probably the, last week we talked about the stronger brothers who thought they could do all this stuff and not be affected by it. They could handle the old ways. And we talked about people. We've probably all known folks that they just felt like they were just a little bit further ahead, and they could handle whatever it might be, and it's not going to really cause them any problems spiritually. But I don't think Paul is there. I think he believes that's probably not going to happen. If you're playing around with this stuff, it's going to be a problem. It can be a trap and so forth. And you can really apply that to all the troubles in the church in Corinth, with the division and they're eating the meat and the whole being affected by idolatry. And they're going to, have some other things that we'll talk about as we go along. But if you think about, here they are, they want to still kind of play around with some of the trappings of the pagan temples and the idolatry and so forth. That's just not going to be good for them. It's going to be dangerous for them, and it's going to send a terrible message to other people. What Paul referred to in chapter 8 as the weaker brothers, which did not mean they were less informed or less spiritual. It just meant they were more troubled by that stuff than the so-called stronger brothers. So, there's probably things that should trouble us that maybe they don't. We are so much more accustomed to things being in your face in our culture than they used to be. Relationships and behaviors that used to be, we talked about this in chapter 5 too, that used to be scandalous, now are like, whatever. They're happy, that's what matters, those kinds of things. So maybe we should be more troubled about things. But he's going to go to the place where it says stay out of the temple, don't get involved in that stuff, extricate yourself from that whole situation. Don't try God's patience. Don't mess with God in that way. The division, the quarreling that was going on there in Corinth, that was like the grumbling and the murmuring and all those things. So they're kind of connecting with some of these issues that Paul uses as examples coming from Israel. And, the idolatry and the grumbling and all those things. And they're doing the same things that Israel was punished for. So do you think that would, if you're hearing this for the first time, would that start to send a message to you? Would that start to make you think, if he doesn't like it for them, maybe he doesn't like it for me? That's kind of where Paul is going there. But it's all balanced by this promise in verse 13. And this is key, I think, to get to this point. If you think you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. But remember that there's nothing that is tempting you that hasn't happened before. I think that's important for us to understand. In our world, and we've all been in situations, the temptation was just really, really difficult. And it's maybe we like to think that, what I'm going through is really more difficult than anybody else. It's really harder. And if I give in to temptation, I'm maybe almost justified because it was so much harder for me than for any of you guys. And Paul says, no, that's really not true. No temptation has seized you except what's common to anybody. There's nothing that is so over the top, that's so incredible, that's so horrible that this is the first time it's ever happened. There is nothing new under the sun. They didn't have the internet and television and all that, but there's nothing new under the sun. They just got into bad stuff through different media, but there is nothing new under the sun. If we struggle with temptation in about anything, somebody else has already done it. So I don't know if that helps you or hurts you, but that is the fact that Paul says here. whatever we feel, whatever we experience, it's already been done. And he goes on to say that God is not going to let you be tempted more than you're able to withstand. Now, we're talking about temptation. This is not, horrible things happening in life. I used to look at that way, and as I got a little bit older and studied, it's like, well, that's not what it's telling me. It's really about temptation. But Paul says he's always going to provide a way out. So, we all have our own temptations. And what is a temptation for one person is no temptation for other. I illustrate that by gambling has never been a temptation for me. I'm going to lose. If I go to a casino, I'm going to lose money. I just know that I will, so I don't, because I don't feel like giving money away. I'll go spend it on, stupid tools that I don't need or something before I give it away to a casino. Not many tools are stupid, by the way. But it's not a temptation for me, but there are things that are. And I know that other people, to drive by a casino, they want to go. It's a big draw. So, whatever affects you may not affect somebody else, but whatever it is, it's hard. It's difficult. That's why it's called a temptation. But God is giving a way out. Do you all agree with that? Yes, ma'am.
This verse is giving me a little strength in saying that when you're being tempted really strongly by something, if we can pray to see that way of escape, we know it's there. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we're blind to it.
Yeah.
And I think we can ask God to help us see that way of escape.
Yeah. That's where I was going with my question. No. That's you're not getting ahead. We're right on point. But yeah, I think anybody else, that's a really good comment. Sarah?
Tempted to find that escape. But also if you just flub up in that temptation and you're deep in the sin, there's still an escape. There's still repentance. There's still a way out.
That's a real good point too. Yeah. So I think sometimes the escape is one that in the moment we don't really want. It's like, well, here's the way out. No, I don't really want to go there. It might be the way out is so difficult that you'd rather not go, not take it, and experience whatever, go with the temptation and accept it. So sometimes we may not see the way out because it's hard, and so we need to ask for help in finding it or in accepting it and in dealing with it. And then if you do get just a little bit too far, hopefully you can kind of start to pull yourself back and pull yourself out of it. But it like you said, this has helped me in so many cases where it's like there is a way out. And sometimes the way out is accepting something that's going to be really hard, which we don't really like to do so much in our culture. And sometimes the way out is to head it off at the pass, so to speak, and just avoid it. I'll give you an example from many, many years. We used to take kids every summer to Central Florida Bible Camp in Eustis, beautiful Eustis, Florida. It's kind of north of Orlando. I went for about 10 years and finally retired from camp when my son graduated high school in 2009. But I ended up, I don't know why, but for some reason I ended up teaching the senior boys Bible class nearly every year. So you get these knothead senior boys in there, and most of them were really great kids. But after 2 or 3 days into the week, you start to kind of get to know each other, and we went basically with the same group every year. So you start kind of building up connections with people. But at some point in the week, I would bring up the idea. Senior boys, teenage boys, hormones are a thing. So I just kind of bring up the idea of immorality, sexual purity. which they love to talk about. Not really. But I would first say to these guys, as a Christian young man, it is your job to not let things get too crazy. Don't put that on your girlfriend. It is your job as a Christian young man to stop at an appropriate time. I don't know if they believe that or not, but I think as a Christian, a lot of them were not dating Christian girls, so maybe they didn't know any better. I would say that first. The other thing I would say to them is, if being in certain places under certain conditions makes it too difficult to stand, don't go there. I don't know what kids do now, how they get alone time with one another, but back in the 70s, we'd go parking. You know, I lived in a small town. It was easy to get out of town where it was country and go find a nice spot and park, whatever. So if that becomes a problem that is, you can't handle that, don't go. Don't be alone with her or him. Don't go there. So the point to that, that's an illustration. The point to that is, you know, sometimes our way out is just to avoid it to begin with. If you know going into the casino, you're going to go to the casino for lunch. You're a hardcore gambling, degenerate gambler, they used to say on the mafia movies. You're a degenerate gambler. I don't really know what that means. But you're going to go to the casino for lunch. That's probably a dumb move. Because along with lunch is going to come, you know, let's go play a hand of whatever. Don't go there. If you know it's a problem, don't go there. And that may be your way out. So what I like about verse 13 is that we're given this promise that, you know, God is going to help us. But we have to do our part as well and take a little bit of responsibility in the whole idea of avoiding temptation and so forth. So as we get to the end of the lesson that Paul has given to the Corinthians, I think we can kind of take that with us and use that for ourselves as well. We are pretty sure there are behaviors that God does not approve of. God's not happy about. We can avoid most of those behaviors just because we know God doesn't want us to do those things, but there are some things that are going to tempt us. And either avoid it, don't go there, or look for that way out. It's going to be there someplace. You got to look for it. You may have to look hard. You may have to pray that God will help you find it. And if you misstep and you get a little bit too far, don't give up. You can pull yourself out of it, but it's going to be there. And I find that to be powerfully encouraging to know. We're not at the whim of the universe, or, you know, Satan is not this uncontrollable force that dominates our lives. If you're a baptized believer, you have God's Spirit that lives within you, and he is infinitely more powerful than the devil. So that is important as well. So just the last, I have this line: don't dabble in activities that tempt you. I think we've kind of already said that a good bit. But that's kind of what the Corinthians, I think, were wanting to do. They wanted to dabble just a little bit. Don't go there. Don't dabble. Step away. Be, you know, where you need to be, away from those things, and trusting God to help you out through the rest of the way. The light is still on. The on-air light is still on. I'm going to pray, and maybe the light will go off, and we'll be finished when we're finished. Let's pray together. Father, we're grateful for the day and the time that we have to be together to study from your word, to see what Paul is telling the Corinthians and how that affects our lives. Help us, Father, to find those ways out. Help us to avoid temptation. Help us, Father, to have the wisdom to not go places that we shouldn't go if it's going to be more than we can bear. We know, Father, that you're with us, that you are protecting us and helping us, but help us do our share of that as well. We thank you for these lessons from Corinthians and how they continue to inform us and shape us even in 2024. Be with us as we go through the rest of the day. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, thank you.